We know that a lot of times with NFL teams, the most popular player on the team from a fan's perspective is the backup quarterback. That's just the way it works. If you don't have one of the elite guys or one of the franchise guys, if you don't already have a young quarterback trying to establish himself, you've got some journeyman veteran like a Ryan Fitzpatrick or a Jay Cutler or somebody like that. A lot of times for a fan base, you can't wait for somebody else to get an opportunity. The backup guy is your favorite player because he's not the starting quarterback. And sometimes you can look at it and you can say, um, you know, there's something to be said about getting some fresh blood in there and getting a new perspective and giving somebody else an opportunity to take the ball and run with it, or throw it, literally, figuratively, whatever. But sometimes there's that thing of, well, just because he's not the starter doesn't mean he's going to be any better, and maybe there's a reason he wasn't the starter to begin with. And there's something to be said about that. And sometimes what can happen is you'll have an established quarterback who gets hurt, and then the backup comes in and takes over. Sometimes they flop, sometimes they do very, very well. And when that backup or that young quarterback comes in and replaces the veteran and they do well, you know, some fans will have the perspective of, the future looks brighter, but it's not the present. But then sometimes you'll have it where, people will say, the past is the past. It was great and wonderful, but that was the past and the future is now. And I look at the Dallas Cowboys and the chatter about who the Cowboys should have as their starting quarterback, and Dak Prescott is the guy right now. But are we ultimately just biding time until Tony Romo is given the job? Is it Dak's job to lose, or is he eventually going to lose it the first glimpse of any real struggle? And I sit there and I say, this is quite interesting because on the one hand, you got Tony Romo, who's been a good quarterback in the league for a lot of years. Um, and the past, in terms of his individual performance, hasn't been bad, but it hasn't necessarily equated to team success. Whereas you've got Dak Prescott, a rookie, fourth round pick, so naturally fans are going to gravitate to that fresh face after a decade of one guy leading the ship to really a mixed bag of success. And ultimately, you're going to sit there and think, hey, this guy's better. This is the guy to roll with. And sometimes that's true and sometimes that's not. But you look at the Dallas Cowboys this year. They're sitting right now as we speak at 12-2. They're staring down the barrel of not just winning the division, not just getting a first round bye in the playoffs, but potentially getting home field advantage throughout the playoffs. And they've done this all behind a rookie quarterback. Now, sure, it's not just him, and he's had a lot of help. He's got the Offensive Rookie of the Year in Ezekiel Elliott to hand the ball off to 25 times a game. He's got the best offensive line in the National Football League to protect him and open gaping holes for Ezekiel Elliott in the running game. So it sometimes goes to show that sometimes a quarterback can elevate the talents of others around them, and sometimes you can put a guy into a really good situation and get more out of him. And I think it's more of the latter when it comes to Dak Prescott. You've put him in a good situation, you've put him in optimal positions to succeed, and more often than not, this season he has. I don't look at Dak Prescott and think he's like a superstar in the making. I don't know that I look at him as he's going to be a big time, potentially elite quarterback in the NFL. But I look at him and you see promise and you see potential and you can see the beginnings of what could be a long run as the Dallas Cowboys starting quarterback. And you look at this season, especially for Cowboys fans, to help paint the picture here. I understand the thought process of if Dak struggles anymore or Dak has another bad game or two, panic kind of setting in. Because in the NFL, you can think that you're set up for long-term success, you can think this and you can think that, but each year is its own deal. You look at the Carolina Panthers, for all intents and purposes, even letting Josh Norman go in free agency, there is no reason in the world that the Carolina Panthers didn't win the NFC South this year. Instead, they're 6-8. Coming off of being a team that went 15-1 last year and made it to the Super Bowl, the best they can finish is 8-8. You never know what can happen one year to the next. So you see where Cowboys fans might be concerned and sit there and say, hey, Dak's gotten us to this point, but is he really the guy to take us over the hump? There's no guarantee we'll be back here next year or any point in time in the near future because, frankly, the Cowboys for many years now have not been very good. And to paint this picture, I will tell you and remind you that the Chicago Bears of all damn organizations have been both to a Super Bowl and an NFC Championship game more recently than the Dallas Cowboys have. Let that sink in for a moment. It has been 21 years since the Dallas Cowboys were last world champions. That's a long time. A long time. I was a freshman in high school. It's been a very, very long time. So I could understand the thought process of Dak has been Dak, but he's benefiting from a good situation and talent around him on the offensive side of the ball. They're benefiting from a somewhat soft schedule. They've gotten to this point, but regular season success does not equate to playoff success, and Romo is still the better quarterback, and da-da-da-da-da. And to which I say for all of that, maybe there's a part of that that's true, but the simple fact of the matter is all this talk about Tony Romo taking over for Dak Prescott, or how much longer is Dak going to have the job, or should he have the job, is ridiculous. The Dallas Cowboys are Dak Prescott's team. That's the way it is, and that's the way it needs to stay. The future is not the future for the Dallas Cowboys. The future is now. Now look, if we were talking about a situation where Dak Prescott had taken over for a Drew Brees, a surefire first ballot Hall of Fame quarterback who has actually won a Super Bowl, then that's one thing. We are talking about a Tony Romo, not necessarily because of his fault alone by any means, but he is the starting quarterback who gets paid a lot of money for many years in Dallas, so he has to take on some of the burden for the failures. But this is a team that has put up some nice offensive numbers over the years and had a lot of mediocre to crappy seasons. You're talking about a Tony Romo in a decade as a starter, I think has 2 playoff victories, 2. And this is the guy that people are clamoring for, some fans, especially the media, because they want to advance a certain narrative to try and create controversy around the most popular team, the biggest ratings draw in the NFL right now in the Dallas Cowboys. They want to make any story they can an excuse to talk about the Cowboys. So let's artificially create this narrative that Tony Romo would be better for the Cowboys right now than Dak Prescott. And it's just a false narrative. You had a similar type of team 2 years ago when you had DeMarco Murray in the backfield instead of Ezekiel Elliott. And the Cowboys won, 12-4 or 13-3? I think it was like 12-4 or something with Tony Romo as their starter. And a lot of Cowboys fans will allude to that divisional round game in Lambeau against Green Bay and talk about that was a catch by Dez Bryant, and if he catches that, they win. And maybe they do. And maybe it should have been a catch. But then people forget that there were still 3.5 minutes or so left in that game. You're in Lambeau, and Aaron Rodgers would have the ball, and I believe he would only have to lead his team down the field for a field goal. And even if he had to lead him down for a touchdown, you're still talking about Aaron Rodgers at home, 3.5 minutes or so left in the game. So sometimes there's these creative narratives that are created by Cowboys fans and by the cocoon of the Cowboys media to advance certain talking points that aren't necessarily grounded in 100% reality. And the 100% reality is that while in theory Tony Romo might be a better quarterback, in theory, it may only be in theory. What matters is who is the better quarterback for the Dallas Cowboys in their current construction. And the simple answer to that is Dak Prescott, and I believe the proof is in the pudding. While he might not be able to make some of the spectacular plays and the big-time throws, he can keep plays alive that Tony Romo couldn't. He also takes care of the ball better than Tony Romo could ever dream of. While everybody wants to talk about all the miraculous fourth-quarter comebacks that Tony Romo's led, and sit there and build this bullshit narrative about this clutch factor that he has, we forget about how many of those games that he played like shit in the first 3 quarters, and the only reason they won was because he finally put it together in the fourth quarter. We also leave out all of the games where there were choke jobs, where he made horrible decisions and terrible throws that cost his team games. And they lost games late in the year when they could have made the playoffs, and instead they finished 8-8. And the simple fact of the matter is, even if you put Tony Romo in, you're talking about a guy who hasn't played much football in 2 seasons now. There's going to be rust and a lot of rust, and you don't know with all the shoulder and collarbone injuries that he's had if he's going to be the same type of guy. You at least know from a Cowboys standpoint what you've got in Dak Prescott now. And you know what you've got in Dak Prescott is good enough to win you a lot of football games, and in the playoffs might be good enough to potentially get you to the Super Bowl. If Tony Romo, frankly, was good enough to get you to the Super Bowl, he would have fucking done so by now. If he would have even been good enough to get you to the NFC Championship game, he would have done so by now. Romo has been a good quarterback for a number of years. Sometimes underrated and underappreciated, sometimes hated just to be hated. But this whole notion by Jerry Jones talking about if and when there's an opportunity to put Romo in, dude, get the fuck over it. You might be having Tony in your fucking luxury box to watch your grandson's high school championship game. But that is not a measure for who is your better field general on the football field right now. And again, the simple answer is Dak Prescott. You talk about a 12-2 Cowboys team whose 2 losses are to the New York Giants by a combined 4 points. And if Terrence Williams gets out of bounds in the opening game of the year, potentially, you're talking about a game-winning field goal by Dan Bailey. You're talking about a 13-1 Cowboys team. And if you're talking about a Cowboys defense that doesn't allow Odell Beckham Jr. to carve through him in the fourth quarter like Swiss cheese on a quick pass and go, you're potentially talking about a 14-0 Cowboys team. How ridiculous is this to sit there and be pining for Tony Romo when your team is tied for the best record in the league, has the best record in the NFC by 2 games, and if they win one of their last 2 games, they will win the division, get a first-round bye, and even better, get home field advantage throughout the playoffs. Furthermore, if you bench Dak now, you run the risk of still not making the Super Bowl with Tony Romo and potentially screwing up the momentum you have with Dak Prescott and really affecting his confidence long term and really killing a lot of the momentum you have with him as an organization. No matter what, you know you have to prepare for life without Romo. Here's the opportunity to prepare for it. You're already in the midst of it. Why would you turn back the clock on that at all? It makes absolutely no sense. If you truly sit there and believe that Tony Romo would do that much more or that much better with this Cowboys team at this point in time, especially bringing him in this late in the year. Let's say you brought him in and played week 17, 1 week as a starter, and then you got 2 weeks off to prepare for the playoffs. Are you really going to feel that confident as a Cowboys fan? Rolling into a home divisional round playoff game with Tony Romo coming off of 1 game played in about 16 months or 14 months, whatever the hell? I mean, he's played, 4 games in 2 seasons? A guy getting in his late 30s with a bunch of collarbone and shoulder injuries, that's who you want to roll with on a potential Super Bowl run. Now, it'll be easy with hindsight being 2020 if the Cowboys stick with Dak Prescott and they don't get to the Super Bowl because maybe the Seahawks beat him, or maybe the Giants beat him, or maybe the Packers get in and they get hot and they beat him. And you say, whoa, if you started Romo, oh, shut the fuck up. The future is now for the Dallas Cowboys. They've gone this deep with Dak Prescott. They've gone balls deep. They need to go all the way and see if they can pump some cum out of it and get to the Super Bowl. That's what it's about. If Tony Romo had even been to a Super Bowl before, let alone even an NFC championship game, maybe I think there's a little bit more of an argument here. But for a quarterback that's barely played in 2 years, they've had a lot of mediocre football that you've had with him and not a lot of winning success. He should be an afterthought at this point. You know, there could be a point in time where Dak gets hurt, he gets a concussion or something. Romo's got to come in and kind of save the day. Maybe he does. And maybe then this is a bigger discussion. But right now, this is just some media bullshit and it needs to stop. The Dallas Cowboys are Dak Prescott's team. That's the way it is, and that's the way it needs to be. Chemistry and momentum can be a wonderful thing. And sure, Dak Prescott may occasionally have that bad game, and he's had a couple of bad games here lately. But how many bad games has Tony Romo had over the past decade of being a fucking starter? You didn't sit there and always hear people pining for him to get benched for this ass fuck or that ass fuck. Why the hell should Dak Prescott get all this talk about being benched? He's earned the right to be the Dallas Cowboys starter. Anybody with a brain can see that. And if they do end up benching him when he's healthy for Tony Romo, the Cowboys deserve the early playoff exit that would ultimately arise as a result. The potential for this lost season, the potential for killing the career momentum of Dak Prescott and keeping themselves in that circle jerk of mediocrity for many years to come.